Mortis Media.
I'm back. Good evening all and welcome. Warren here from A Warning to the Curious, the Night Floaters. You know, the guy who sounds just like Garfield. Sorry for the lame intro, but we're on a low budget here. A very low budget. Once again, Mort has been kind enough to invite me to help narrate some stories about getting into strange cars with complete and sometimes less than salubrious strangers. Taxis and Ubers can be efficient ways to get around, but sometimes they just might take you down mean streets to the off-ramp of the highway to hell, Route 666, and leave you thinking, why didn't I just take the bus? Walk even. So, it's time to get comfortable. Turn out the lights and shut your eyes and let yourself sit back in the passenger seat. The meter's running, the doors are locked, and the car is in gear. 'Cause it's time to let the darkness take control.
I work a long commute away from home and depend on the train. There were some issues that caused the trains to be cancelled for hours, which left me stranded about an hour and a half away from home. At the train station, there were a few others who were all heading to my city, and we decided to split a taxi. The people were Woman 1, Lisa, heading to my city to see a gig. She was a bit tipsy. A guy called Kyle traveling with Lisa. They're not dating, but their conversation seemed to make out that they were very good friends. He was beyond drunk, and it made me a bit uncomfortable because he was pissing in a bush and kept making vulgar comments about Lisa's hot cousin. Then this other dude, John. He was traveling alone and mentioned that he lived in my city, just moved there, but was in the town we were leaving from as he just broke up with his girlfriend and was picking up stuff from her place. And another woman who I'll talk about later. This other woman decided to stay at her mother's house in the town for another evening, so drops out of the taxi ride. That should have been my cue to also drop out, but they had just rung the taxi and I didn't want to ruin it, as they already calculated how much we each needed to pay. I decided to ask Lisa if she could sit next to me, and she said she understood completely, and said that she would sit in the middle. So the seating arrangement was drunk Kyle sat at the front, me on one side, Lisa in the middle, and John as well. Mind, from where we were parked there was no danger to getting in from the other side, as there were no oncoming cars. He opened the door on my side and just stared at me. Then Lisa says cheerfully for me to sit on the other side, as she wanted the middle seat to talk to Carl more easily. John stared at us for a second time, then scoffed and slowly walked over to the other side and got in. The ride itself was awkward, as Lisa and Kyle were both drunk and dirty laundry was aired. That's how I gathered that they were sleeping together. Lisa was drinking still before she finally said she needed to go to the toilet and was desperate. The taxi man found a public leisure center for him to pull into. She got out and went inside. Mistake number 2. I should have gone with her. I just didn't think about it. Normally I go with female friends in restaurants or bars, but because it was in a taxi and freezing outside, I just stayed. Kyle and John went out to smoke a cigarette. Then John came back when he saw Lisa coming out. He scooted over to the middle, then put his hand on my upper thigh and rested it there. Regret number 3. I should have said something and made a scene, but I just froze completely. Lisa opened the door, looked at John, looked at me, then looked at John's hand on my thigh, about 2 inches away from my lady parts. She cheerfully said to him, "Oh, I'm so sorry, can we switch places? I love sitting in the middle." John looked pissed. He looked over at me, who was still frozen, removed his hand from my thigh, and scooted out to make room for her. He grumbled something I couldn't hear before Lisa said, "Thank you," and came in next to me. John sat in his allocated seat this time and we took off. Lisa then took my hand and whispered, "Woman to woman, I'll make sure you get home safe." I was just tearing up and said thank you. Then throughout the journey, about 4 to 5 times after Lisa had leaned forward to speak to Kyle, John slipped his hand to her seat, so when she would sit back down he would touch her ass. Every time she just giggled and said, "Oh, sorry, I think I sat on your hand." I felt awful because she was in this position because of me, so I apologized and she just repeated that she'll get me home safely. She was very drunk at this point from the extra taxi drinking, so I think she just latched onto that mission. When we got close to the city centre, Lisa asked me where I needed to get to, and I told her the general area. John said he moved into an area that is literally in the opposite direction. His suburb is north, and I'm south of the city centre. He said after Kyle and Lisa got out that we would share a taxi, despite that making no sense, as we lived in completely different directions from each other. I said, no, that's fine, but he was insistent and wouldn't take no for an answer. Lisa was too drunk and crying about how much she loves her dog at this point to protect me, and I texted my husband that I was terrified and if he could walk up to come get me. My husband booked it over there as fast as he could, and after we got out the taxi, John was getting his bags out the trunk, and I said bye to Lisa and just ran as fast as I could to make it to my husband. We say it all the time, but it needs to be said again. Screw being polite when you feel scared. John probably latched onto me because I was traveling alone, while Lisa was with a man. Lisa is right. Girls need to stick together. I should have gone with her to the toilet.
This happened a couple of months ago, December of last year. I started working a new job in the mall and had to work for most of Boxing Day. I was done at 10 p.m. and transit seems to have ended at 7 p.m. I'm a student who didn't go home for the holidays due to this job and never had to deal with holiday transit hours. I decided to call an Uber, and the driver picked me up right in front of the mall. We had a casual conversation during the drive back, and he learned about where I worked and how I'm living on my own for the time being, since my roommates went to their hometowns. Fast forward to the next day at work, around 6 p.m. This driver walks into the store and tries to strike a conversation with me, but I told him I had to get back to work. He also asked if we could hang out later, to which I said no, and he left. At the end of that shift, 10 p.m., I walked out of the store, planning to take transit. As soon as I stepped out of the store, the driver immediately pulled up next to me and offered to give me a free ride back home. After going back and forth, with me declining and him saying it's free, I decided to walk away and caught a bus home. I was pretty overwhelmed by the fact he showed up to my workplace and waited 3 hours until I was done work to offer me a ride home. I reported this to Uber, and they've notified me that they suspended this driver, provided me with a full refund, and gave me a link to provide to the police if I plan on filing a report. Silly of me to give away information like that to a stranger, but I hope to never meet that driver again, who appeared twice my age, knows where I work and live. Lesson learnt, 110%.
It was 2006, and I was 17. I was dating a boy a few years older in the neighboring town from mine. My parents were not too keen on the fact I was dating an older guy, so they were not trying to give me rides over to his house or anything. His car was broken down at the time, and I didn't have a car, so I was on my own. Sometimes if I was feeling energetic, I'd walk to his house after school. It was about a 45-minute walk, which sucked, but I did it sometimes. When either of us had a few extra dollars, I would take a cab. I was a nervous person, always taught about stranger danger, and I'm really good at reading people with bad vibes. I called my boyfriend, who called me a cab and would pay for it when I got there. The guy picked me up and started making his way to my boyfriend's house. He was a younger guy, but older than my boyfriend and I, maybe around 25. Right away I got sketched out by the way he looked at me, staring at me up and down, and insisted I sit in the front seat. He said his back seat was pretty messy and liked to chat. Red flag number 1. It's a cab. Why is your back seat messy? I was getting serious bad vibes. I got in the front and thought a quick 10-minute cab ride will be over soon. I messaged him to tell him I was in the cab and that I would be there at 10 minutes. The driver just starts talking, asking me questions about my life and whatnot. I don't remember the exact details, but I do remember telling him that I would be going to my boyfriend's house, but he had to get another person and drop them off first. I was like, what? And alarm bells were going off in my head. I was thinking that this is not what normally happens, but he is a guy who worked for a legit cab company, meaning his job knew where he was, so he couldn't do anything, right? He got on the walkie and lied to the cab company, saying he didn't pick me up yet and was going to another fare closer by first. I planned on jumping out the cab and running if he tried anything. Well, he ended up picking up the other person, an old man in the same direction of my boyfriend's house. He didn't mention his messy back seat to the guy. The customer was talking and like, oh, so you're bringing your girlfriend to work? And the driver didn't even correct him and just say, no, she's a customer. So I knew something was wrong and messaged my boyfriend on the sneak. He called me and asked to talk to the driver. I don't know what he said, but he was obviously pissed off and the driver hung up. He was like, why'd you call him? I'm not a creep. I just wanted you to help me with my route. He handed me a stack of papers, asking if I could help him pick up another customer and he would drop me off at the end. I told him I needed to get to my boyfriend's now. I don't know how, but he ended up dropping me off and peeling away before my boyfriend could get his hands on him. I can't imagine what would have happened if I didn't have a boyfriend who was angry on the phone and shook him. That's the most I remember. I'm sure there are details that I missed. But we did call the cab company and file a complaint. I'm not sure what ever came of it. I never took another cab for a long time, and now to this day, I always get nervous if I have to take an Uber home and stay on the phone while sharing my location at all times. Thanks for running cabs for me.
A little backstory. My son has been battling cancer for over 2 years. He receives treatment at a hospital in a neighboring state, nearly 3 hours from our home. Our only car broke down during this time. Due to financial issues, cancer treatments are expensive, even with insurance. We just couldn't afford to get it fixed or replaced. We were stuck using medical transportation through our insurance to get to and from appointments. Transportation is provided by contracted individuals who use their private vehicles. Most drivers live in our home state. This story involves one of those drivers and took place almost a year ago. My son and I were leaving the hospital to return home after a 1-week inpatient stay for chemotherapy. We had problems with the driver we were assigned hours in advance of him even showing up. Over an hour after the scheduled pickup time, I called the dispatch to see if they could get an ETA. They contacted him and told me he was just coming into the city, but because of traffic, he didn't want to give an estimate as to when he would arrive. Weird, but fine. I figured he would be less than half an hour away. So we waited. And waited. After another 2 hours of waiting, I called again. This time he told dispatch that he was just crossing the state line and would be at the hospital in about 2 hours. WTF? Needless to say, I was not at all amused. Maybe I was being a Karen, but we were both exhausted and just wanted to get home to the rest of our family. Besides that, the ride was scheduled in advance. He knew several days ahead of time what time he was supposed to be there. Drivers are supposed to be there, waiting at time of discharge. 5 hours later, more than 8.5 hours after our scheduled pickup time, he finally called me to say he had arrived. By this time, I was beyond irritated with this guy. He had obviously lied to dispatch more than once. While he was helping put our bags in the trunk, and before we even left the hospital parking, he had misgendered my son several times. My son has a masculine name. He also very definitely looks like a boy. It honestly felt like he was doing it on purpose. I corrected him, kindly, even though I was pissed at this point. He apologized and told us that he had had a massive heart attack a few years ago and had brain damage from lack of oxygen because he stopped breathing during the event. So I felt a little bad for being mad, but also a little concerned and a little incredulous. I couldn't help feeling like this was a cover story designed to placate and manipulate. I might have become more of a Karen in my thinking towards him at this point. He was chatty, and I was also talking to him. I was being perfectly friendly, even though I wasn't happy with him. After we got on the road to start our 3-hour drive home, he began texting while driving. I told him to stop. He said he was texting his wife to let her know he was on his way back. I said that I didn't care who he was texting. He wasn't going to text and drive with my child in the car. He should have done it before we left the hospital, or he could pull over if it was that important. I wasn't unkind, but I was matter-of-fact about it. He was visibly irritated, but he put his phone down. After that, he would straight up ignore anything I said to him, and he had stopped talking. I gave it a few goes, trying to be friendly and show that I wasn't mad, but he wanted no part of it, so I got out my Kindle and started to read. A few times, I noticed him slyly slide his phone up onto his leg. It was obvious he was trying to do this without me noticing. Each time I noticed, I would turn my Kindle off and look out at the road. He would let out an exaggerated sigh and slide his phone back down into the center console. After a few minutes, I would go back to reading. When we finally got to our house, he didn't even say anything to me when he gave me the logbook to sign. He also didn't get out of the car to help carry our stuff to the house, which is something the drivers are supposed to do. I honestly didn't care about the last part because I just wanted to get away from the guy. It was nearly midnight at this point. Less than half an hour after we got home, I got a text from a blocked number, something that has never happened to me previously. The text was a string of insults and expletives commenting on everything from the quality of my character to my looks. I have no way of proving it, of course, and maybe I was jumping to conclusions, but I felt like this message had come from the driver. Very few people have my phone number, and it was such a short time after our encounter with him ended. It just seemed the most likely scenario. The following day, my husband convinced me to report the driver for texting while driving. I made no mention of the text while talking to the company because I had no proof he was the origin. There weren't any further texts at this time. About a week later, an investigator from the transportation company called to get more information about the incident. I told only the facts of what happened. Once again, I did not mention the text. The investigator told me the driver would be written up and sent for additional training. The next day, I received another text from a blocked number. This one was full of more personal attacks and colorful language. I don't remember the details because this was nearly a year ago, but there was a vague threat and a mention of messing with someone's livelihood. That last part made me really think the messages were from the driver, especially since the text came a little over 24 hours after the investigator called me. I figured he had probably just received the reprimand and sent the text in response. Still, I had no proof it was him, and it was still just a theory on my part. Over the next several days, the messages kept coming in, escalating in tone. I finally decided it might be time to report them to the police, when the next text left little doubt in my mind as to who was sending them, as it made mention of the report I made to the transportation company. It also contained less vague threats and mentioned that he still had my address in his GPS. I filed a police report. They investigated. Unfortunately, the messages came from an untraceable, prepaid phone. I changed my number and the messages stopped. I also made an additional report to the transportation company where I provided the texts and a police report to the investigator. The police had already been in contact with them, and the company had already let the driver go. We also moved shortly after the last text. Maybe it was a silly thing to do, but the guy did make some pretty serious threats, and he did know where we lived. I know most people are just full of hot air when they make those kind of threats, but we weren't willing to take any chances. There are some very scary people out there. Also, it might have proved to be warranted. Fast forward to the first week in May of this year. While watching the 6 o'clock news, we see a story about a local man who had an altercation with his brother that ended in the brother stabbing him 20 plus times. The man later died at the hospital, and the brother was wanted for murder. When they showed the name of the brother in his photo, I nearly fell out of my seat. It was the driver. He was apprehended by police by the time the 11 o'clock news aired. So, dangerous driver, let's not meet.
I study away from home, but go back for the holidays and other events. I went back home for New Year's after spending Christmas with my partner and his family. Outside the train station is a taxi area, and I got one to take me to my family home since it was late in the evening and I had a large suitcase with me. The driver starts out by making small talk, asking if I had a long journey and where I travelled from, and what brings me here. I answered his questions to not sound rude, and said I was visiting family for the holidays because I study away. He starts asking more questions that I didn't realise were weird at the time. I'm autistic, so social cues aren't my strong point, asking if I have any siblings. I have 4. How old they are, and if they're all from the same parents. Looking back, it's weird, but as I said, he seemed to be just coming off as friendly. He asked if my parents were still together, which I felt was a bit too much, so pretended I didn't hear him. He then asks how old I am, if I have a boyfriend, and I told him I was 20 and I do, hoping that he would stop talking. We get to my street, and I ask him to drop me off at the end because I don't like being dropped off at my house by strangers, so they don't know exactly where I live. He tells me how much the fare was, $6.50, and I saw the meter. So I gave him a 10 and he gives me $3.50 change. I get out and head down the street to my house. About 10 days later, there's a knock at the door. My mum answers thinking it's a parcel. and it's the driver. He asks if I'm in and asks for me by name. I had work that day and got the train in my uniform, so I had my badge on, which I forgot about. I know I didn't tell him my name because that's too much for me. My mum tells him I'm not in, and he starts looking past her in the house, presumably to see if I'm hiding. He then tells her that he just realised he didn't give me the right change, and he was here to give me the £1 he owes me. My mum assured him that he can keep it and that it's fine, but he's very insistent and asks if he can come in to give it to me. My mum tells him again that I'm not here, but was upstairs, and he offers to wait until I'm back. My mum told him he couldn't come in because she doesn't know him and there are children in the house, including my 1-year-old niece. After 10 minutes of saying he'll wait, and my mum asking for him to leave, he gives her this £1 before leaving and sitting in his car in the resident park on my street for another 10 minutes. He eventually leaves, which I guess means he was given a job, so thank God. I genuinely think he read my badge. I forgot I had it on, and then he watched me walk to my house so that he could come back later. Otherwise, he knocked on at least 10 other doors to find me, which is almost worse. The whole taxi ride he kept telling me what a pretty girl I am, so that makes the whole situation, to me, even more unsettling. I'm now terrified of getting another taxi and worried that he'll come back, not for my sake, but because there are young kids in the house. Very creepy encounter, and it's taken me a good few days to just process how weird it truly is.
Firstly, I would like you to keep in mind that in my country, there is nothing to distinguish taxis from regular cars. No colors, model, type, sign, nothing. Any car you see on the street can be a taxi. When I started high school at 12, that was the first time I ever took a taxi by myself. I attended primary school with one of my older brothers, and at the end of the school day, we would both take a taxi home, as this was very common in my country. At the time of attending school with my brother, whenever it came time to go home, my brother was always in charge. That meant I didn't have to stop taxis for myself, nor did I ever feel a need to pay attention to the taxi drivers. After my brother graduated, I still remained in that school, but for the remaining 2 years, either my mother would pick me up or I would walk home by myself. We had moved to a closer house since the time my brother attended school with me. When I got into high school, we'd moved in with my grandmother, which was much farther from my school, but still in the area where the school was located. This was the first time in my life I would have had to use a taxi to get home on my own. Because of my dependence on my brother in primary school, I was very unfamiliar with the taxi drivers in this area. My school and home were all in the same area, just at very different points in that area, and so I was scared to stop a taxi. I don't know exactly how many days into my new school life of taxiing home alone, a car stopped in front of me and asked where I was headed to. This isn't uncommon where I live. Taxi drivers would stop for you, even if you don't stop them. Also, it is very common for students to take taxis home, even from the age of 10. I told the driver the street where I lived, and he told me to hop in. There were other students in the car, so I didn't feel too uncomfortable and hopped right in, and he dropped me off. Weeks and weeks went by, and me taxiing with him became more and more frequent, to the point of almost every day he would take me home. I wouldn't even stop him when I saw him. If he saw me, he would stop for me, which, once again, isn't uncommon. However, as time went by, Sam, my given name for this taxi driver, started to make me a bit uncomfortable. Here's why. He would always make me sit in the passenger seat. I don't know how it is in other countries, but if movies are anything to go by, The taxi service here is very different. Here, you pay for the seat, not the car ride. Because of that, you would have to share a ride with 3 other persons heading in the same area as you. I personally lived basically at the end of where taxis travel to. So because of these 2 reasons, at first I always thought that he told me to sit in the passenger seat so that I won't have to go in and out of the car if someone was getting out before me. But regardless, he would always make me sit in the passenger seat. If I hopped in the back when he stopped to pick up other passengers, he would tell me to come out and sit up front with him. If the car had no other passengers when I got in, he would tell me to sit in the front seat instead of the back. I thought this was normal, but in hindsight, I see that he was making it easier for him to do the second reason he started to make me uncomfortable. I was always into music, big music lover, so whenever I was taxiing home, I would have my earphones in, listening to music. Sam would try to make conversation with me, but I would have my earphones in and not hear him. To get my attention, he would always brush me on my forearm. Always. He made it a habit of touching me skin on skin, on my upper arm that was tucked into my chest whenever I had my arms folded, on my inner arm when I had them folded in my lap, on my wrist when I didn't have my hands folded. His fingers would touch me. He would always stop for me, no matter what. There was a time there was no room in his car because he had his kids in the car, but he made me share the passenger seat with his kid, who was already occupying it. I assume they were his because they were very young primary school kids, and they were way too comfortable with eating and drinking in his car. If he was driving in the opposite direction, it's just one straight road with lots of side roads to and from the taxi stand and the end of the route, he would stop for me and tell me to get in. One time he even stopped for me and told me to get in while his wife, or girlfriend, was in the passenger seat. I know it was his wife because the back seat had a lot of grocery bags, and they were talking about domestic things. I have no idea what excuse he gave her to justify him picking up and dropping home a student while he wasn't working. Like I mentioned before, I lived basically at the end of the route for the taxi drivers in that area. There is a street right before where I lived that's a sort of long street that once you get in, you'd take a good 3 minutes to get out of it if the passenger lived far inside. Because of this, taxi drivers would usually drop me off first, then drop the other passengers off on their way back down out of courtesy, and because it's easier since I live literally less than a minute from that street. Sam would not. He would take me with him on the long drive into that street whenever he picked up a passenger that was stopping off there. Since it's just before the end of the route, it would usually be me and that passenger last in the car, and when he dropped them off, it would be just me and him. On the ride back out of the street with me and him alone, he would drive slower and would make conversation with me. I genuinely don't remember them, but I do remember feeling scared. To note, I live in a very green area, actually inside a rainforest, so there's lots of trees and forestry areas about, and especially in that long road. It freaked me out because there weren't many houses in certain parts of the street, and just trees and forest. So if he wanted, he could have taken me there, and no one would know. Sam stopped taking my money. Whenever he dropped me off, I would pay, and eventually, he declined me once or twice, until he kept declining me. I still attempted to give him the money every single ride, but he would decline. I would try even in the presence of other passengers, but he would still decline my money. I was really scared of him, but stupidly, every time he stopped to pick me up, I would get in the car with him. Because of things that happened to me previously, I had a very hard time, and still do, telling people no, so I couldn't bring myself to turn away at that time. What really scared me was, one day, as he was driving out of the long forestry street, he stopped the car and he told me something. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. I was 12. I didn't really like boys like that at the time. When he said it, it literally made me frozen in fear. He basically told me that the first time he saw me, he really liked me, and that's why he stopped for me. In my country, there's the term, "my blood took you," which is a very strong term. I don't know how to describe it. It means that whoever says that to you really liked you without having to know you or talk to you or anything like that. I guess it would be similar to love at first sight, but it's a lot stronger than seeing. It's blood. It's like saying someone was destined to be with you. Your blood was made to love them. Here is this grown man with a wife and children saying that his blood was made to love 12-year-old me. I was petrified. It felt like I couldn't move. The car wasn't moving, and this man just expressed a very strong attraction to me while we're basically in the middle of nowhere. I was so scared. He asked me if I liked him back, and I don't even remember what I said at first, but he kept asking as the car started moving again. I told him I wasn't sure and I had to think about it. With a terrified smile on my face, he told me to think about it now, and I repeated that I didn't know and I would have to think about it. He dropped me home, and I just remember the entire time he kept asking me if I liked him back. Before I got out of the car, he told me to think about it and give him a reply next time. When I got home, there was no one there. My siblings were still at school, and my mother was at work. I went into my room, lay on the bed, and cried. I cried for hours because I was terrified. I was scared he would come to my house and confront me. I was scared my mother would find out and I would get into trouble with her. I was scared because I had not told her about this taxi driver that was making me uncomfortable, because I was scared I would get blamed for always getting in his car with him. The whole weekend I was in fear that he would come to my house because he knew where I lived. The following Monday, when I was waiting for a taxi, I saw his car approaching and I kept my head down. I didn't have a phone. I just had an iPod Nano, which didn't have many features on it, but I pretended I was distracted on that and didn't see him. He honked his horn at me because he was keeping back the flow of traffic, and I continued to ignore him. He drove away. The next day, the same thing happened. His car was approaching, and I kept my focus on my iPod, just scrolling through the songs to seem busy. He honked, and I continued to ignore him, so he drove away. I looked up, and he was still there. He was parked at the side of the street, a little further down, instead of in front of me. I just shook my head no, and turned away, and he drove off. The next few days was a repeat of this. He would stop, and I would ignore him. He would drive down a bit more, park and honk at me, or just park there in silence, watching me until he couldn't stay there anymore. Years had gone by, and I didn't see him, oddly enough. I don't know where he went or what happened to him, but I was beyond relieved. until my last year of high school. I was waiting for a taxi at a taxi stand where there were lots of taxis, including him. When I saw him, I felt everything in me go numb. As he got closer, he called out to my mother and asked her if she was heading in the direction we live, since he knew where I lived. My mother said yes and was walking to his car. I felt my entire heart drop, my feet go cold, and my face heat with fear. I was terrified of my mother finding out about my involvement with this man. I was scared he would twist it to say I was the one after him, and my mother believing him because I didn't tell her about it. I was scared he would tell my very strict mother that we were in some sort of relationship. I quickly mumbled to my mother that I didn't want to get into his car because he creeped me out. I didn't say it to hint that I knew him or anything. My mother stopped walking, turned to look at me, then turned back to Sam and said, "Never mind, my daughter said you creep her out." 1. To add, I live in the Caribbean. 2. The time between when this all happened and when I saw him while I was with my mother was about 3 years. I didn't see him in those 3 years, so I kind of forgot about him until I was with my mother. It's been 4 years after that, and oddly enough, I have never seen him again. 3. Physically, he reminded me a lot of one of my favorite musicians at the time. Because of this, I can't look at photos or videos of this musician because he really does look like him, and it makes me feel uneasy. I can still listen to his music, but I stopped thinking, watching, or looking for updates on that musician.
A few years back, I was without a car and lived in what we consider the downtown area of Pensacola, Florida. Being that I didn't have a car, I frequently Ubered to and from work, and sometimes from bars downtown if it was late, and felt unsafe as a small lesbian walking home. Our town doesn't have a lot of hate crime, but unwelcome confrontation from religious people and just general ignorant people. I never really had a problem with any of my drivers until I met James. James was, I assume, from somewhere else, because his English wasn't as good. Obviously, not a problem. He'd picked me up to take me to and work a few times, but I had a hard time understanding him, so our conversations were short and confusing. One of times, instead of talking, he sang to me the name game. I have a usual conversation, but it rhymes with Bailey, Haley, Kaylee, etc. That happened. It was okay. Kind of funny, but it lasted the 20-minute ride home, so I got weird and didn't know what to say after a while. Fast forward to a few months later. I had drank a few beers at a local dive bar, and it was time for me to walk home. I realized I was probably too drunk to walk, because who the hell where my drunk mind would let me wander off to? So I called an Uber, and it was James. He recognized me and I climbed into the car, and we proceeded to my house. I was only maybe 2 miles from it. Not a bad walk during the day, but at night, nah. Or James decides that instead of going home, he wants to stop by and buy me a Whataburger, because I need food before I get home, right? Sweet, right? So instead, he drives me to Whataburger. At the point, I'm so cool and happy with what's happening. Well, here comes Whataburger, and he drives straight past it. I'm like, "Hey, that was it." And he says, "Yeah, I know, but I forgot my wallet at my house, so we're gonna go there first." That's when I start to sober up and tell him no, just take me home. Well, he doesn't stop, and first argues that I should be nicer as he's doing me a favor. So I get a little more vocal, and after he says, "Fine, I'll turn around," and said something in another language that I can only assume was obviously a derogatory term. I felt like I couldn't wait, so I hopped out at a red light and just risked the walk home. That would have just been 2 miles, but is now about 4 because I'm down by the Whataburger. End of story. I did make it home safe, but sadly on my way home, the police stopped and searched me because I was out late and they considered this a bad neighborhood. They didn't even want to give me a ride home because it's such a bad neighborhood. They didn't care about the weird driver because nothing happened, and it was quite creepy to me. I dinged his rating, and I think it was only a month or two after I had bought a car. But after that encounter, I had a few friends who were more than willing to help me with work till I got my car right. I don't know if he sees Uber requests and when he saw mine declined it, because I had a lot of dropped Ubers and my rating is still 5 stars.
When I was in college, I found myself Ubering to make money. This was in Southern California, and LA at the time was a constant flow of work. Occasionally, you'd pick people up in a nice area, and they'd tell you that they were sleeping with someone in a relationship, or that they themselves were cheating. This was depressingly common. I think that saying what they were doing to someone gave them a weird kind of relief. Once, I drove someone from Hollywood to Hemet, California. He was very charming and funny. When I dropped him off, it was at a big blue building that they buzzed us into. He left me a $200 cash tip. I later found out this is what is known as gold base for the Church of Scientology. If you don't know what that is, it's a completely normal, not weird at all, in any way location owned by the Church of Scientology. Feel free to Google it. A few months into my taxi career, insurance companies started using rideshare services, and some people who were more down on their luck would use it. Sometimes this was people just trying to get their kids to school, but sometimes it was much sadder. I can't tell you how many times I showed up to a doctor's office to see someone with accessibility limitations face drop at seeing my tiny car instead of a van like they needed. The people with substance problems were interactions that would stay with you. Once I picked up a man going to a dental appointment, and I drove him for about half an hour. He told me about how he used to run drugs in the 90s, until they caught him with a few pounds of coke. He told me about when he was moved from Nevada to Florida for trial, how he traveled handcuffed in a van, how the cops would stop only once a day at McDonald's, and for their $1 menu item of the day. He asked me to stop at a liquor store. He chugged a tiny bottle of booze, shoved mints into his mouth, then sipped on a soda. He smelled like pure alcohol when I dropped him off at the dentist. Near my house, there was a methadone clinic. I would get up before dawn to be able to take those rides. Early bird gets the worm, right? Almost always they were sweet and thankful. Sometimes they were a little out of it, but I never felt in danger or anything like that. Just good people going through tough times. These rides were the most consistently depressing. People who were going to court clearly drunk or high. Older women who had trouble requesting a ride and had been waiting in the parking lot of their dialysis place into the night. They tell their stories sometimes. A person who was going to court for a child custody case. People struggling with mental illness. Some mornings were exhausting. Being up that early, you'd hit another crowd that I had never anticipated. Funeral goers. The saddest funeral ride was when a man and a woman got into my back seat. Rather than speaking to me, the man handed me a neon printout of a map of a cemetery with instructions on what plot to go to, with, "Hello, I am attending my father's funeral. My wife and I are deaf, Please follow these directions," written on the back of it. The whole ride, I could hear them signing to one another and trying not to cry. There were also the retired gamblers. They'd leave their houses at 7 in the morning, take a $70 Uber out to the desert, and spend the whole day gambling at the reservation casinos. The desert is where I saw the weirdest things. The desert was the only place I have ever felt scared driving. It was in Temecula, the wine country of SoCal. Lots of wooded roads and desert. I picked up a lady just off the freeway at what I initially assumed was the edge of a golf resort, but it was an unpaved access road. It was late and that area was especially dark. I was getting ready to call the passenger when I saw them coming down the unpaved access road. It was a tall blonde woman in a very nice pantsuit. She was absurdly put together, considering that she had walked God knows how long in heels down a dirt rock road. She got into the car and was very pleasant. She said she lived in a gated community that was hard to get Ubers to, and it was easier to send me to the access road. I thought it was weird, but I did not want to be creepy asking about where she lived. She was friendly, chatty even. She was going to a dinner party, and as she spoke to me, I could feel her looking at me in the rearview mirror the entire ride. We drove a half hour away from the freeway to one of those rural chic neighborhoods that you would hear celebrities had huge parties at. Eventually, we reached the address, which was a paved road lined with trees. She told me to keep driving, and I didn't think much of it because, again, we were in a mansion-style neighborhood. We hit a white ranch-style fence after a minute or so, going down the road. This is when I started to feel a bit uneasy. There were around a dozen no trespassing signs and one of those classic "forget the dog, beware of owner" signs with a guy pointing a pistol at you. I thought it was more than a little blunt to have that many signs, but hey, not my property. We drove for about a minute when we came to another fence. It was at the top of a hill, and it overlooked a barn with some lights in the distance. I know this sounds weird, but it was unpleasant. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just a barn with what looked like a barbecue going on, but being out in the woods without any light had freaked me out. The passenger told me I could just slide the gate open. As I approached the fence, I saw some signs that made me stop cold. Off to the side of the gate, not quite in the dark, but on the fringes of my headlights, there were metal signs with bullet holes through them, swastikas and Confederate flags brightly displayed. SoCal has a lot of white supremacist pockets. I had dropped off dozens of passengers in cities like Norco and driven down streets with people drinking in the garage and a Nazi flag proudly hung behind them. It wasn't my favorite, but I wasn't spending any time in those neighborhoods, more than I needed to. This was different, though. It was after 11 p.m. at night, and I had no idea where I was. I opened the gate, and down the road, I saw what I assume were cell phone flashlights lighting up and coming up the incline. This made me very uncomfortable. I went back and I told the woman that I didn't think my car could make it back up the hill if I went down it. "What are you talking about? Just take me, it's right there." She was getting more heated, and I could see the lights slowly making their way up the hill. She kept telling me I needed to cancel the ride, and that she wouldn't pay to not be taken the entire way. I told her the pin I was supposed to take her to was a mile back up the road, but I was so nervous I relented and canceled on my end. She slammed the door as she got out. I took off before I could see the cell phone light people get closer. The road back was much rougher at the speed I was going at. I felt a bump that felt like I hit a body, but I kept going. My car was driving poorly, but I kept driving till I was past the fence and out of the rich neighborhood. Eventually, I stopped at a gas station. My right rear tire was messed up and I needed to change it. There were a few nails that looked like they had been attached to a piece of wood in my tire. I was freaked out so hard, and sometimes I wish I had called the cops and reported it. But of course, all that happened was I got a flat on a back road, and I didn't want to spend the rest of my night waiting on a cop car. I know it's far more likely that I freaked myself out than a bunch of Nazis were planning to mess with a random Uber driver. But when I pick up a well-dressed businesswoman from a remote location and drop her off at a separate remote location, it gives me chills that I have trouble explaining to this day.
It was Sunday night. I was at the airport about to request an Uber when I checked the Lyft prices. $20 cheaper. So I take Lyft. I requested one and almost cancelled because it was taking a while to find someone when eventually a driver was found. Pretty much as soon as I entered the car and we started driving, he saw where I lived and started talking about murdering people, especially those on bikes in the city I live in. It wasn't just a one line either. He kept going on about it, how he'd get the cold sweats afterwards, and decided he didn't want to feel that, so he tried not to. During this, I'm messaging my boyfriend because the dude is making me feel super weird. I wasn't really trying to converse with him, so all of this was unsolicited information. Then he starts saying how he was going to do haunted houses and makes it seem super lame and like it was over, and then once you leave when you thought you were safe, he'd get you. I ask him, how would you do that? Because I feel like a lot of people are really aware of their surroundings and I would definitely see you coming. He then said, you never know, I might just get you tonight. I laughed and said, I don't think so, as he's literally pulling up to my apartment. When we parked, he just kept talking and I was like, okay, bye, and I had to unlock the car door myself. And when I went to get the luggage from my trunk, he almost took off with it. It was weird too. Both when he picked me up and dropped me off, he'd just stand behind me like a weirdo. It was super uncomfortable. He definitely knows which apartment I lived in, and I'm pretty sure Lyft fired him. It's been a few weeks and I haven't seen him or his car hanging around my place even once, but I will continue to keep an eye out for him. I reported this to Lyft and the police department in the city, and threats were made.
This also happened quite a while ago. My lifestyle at the time was very high risk. This story means a lot to me, as it restored my much needed faith in humanity. To explain why this incident meant so much to me, I need to provide a bit of backstory. I lived in a really sketchy part of town. The particular building I lived in was a refurbished loft with a very ugly history. You could still see the damage in the concrete walls from all the gunfire it had taken at one point. Talking the pizza guy into delivering was always fun. No, sir. It's not still a crime scene. Yes, real people live here. There was the local gas station within walking distance. Your typical shady place populated by shady people doing shady things. I had and still have a tendency to be somewhat chatty and polite when spoken to by strangers, especially if I frequent that store and see them often. I wound up making friends with a man named Houston, who had a talent for obtaining recreational plant life. We would hang out and philosophize about life and the like. I always felt he had a good soul. I was coming home from a bar I frequented one night. It was a Friday and that area was a popular night spot, so at closing time cabs would line up. I was quite drunk, but sober enough to know better than to drive. The cab driver was talkative. I was not. I just wanted to go home and watch the world spin. Almost immediately, out of his mouth came some of the most lecherous and disgusting things I had ever heard. He would arch his neck around while driving, lick his lips and say things like, "Oh, baby, you so pretty. You want me to, What are these guys thinking? Has any woman ever responded with, "Oh my God, finally a greasy cabbie wants to feel my chest. My life's dream has come true"? All joking aside, I was scared spitless. Not only does this man have me in a moving vehicle, but he knows where I live. I had no phone and just enough money for the ride home. I was terrified. "You want me to pull over? Pretty drunk girl, you want me?" I, being the smartass I am, responded with, "No thank you. I'd like to go home and vomit." It was as if I hadn't said anything at all to the man. He kept turning around and reaching out to grab me as I swerved out of his reach. "Show him to me. I want to see him." The situation escalated when he started to drive around aimlessly, pulling into darkened complexes and slowing down to try and grab me. I had to do something, so I did something I don't think he was expecting. I flirted with him. I leaned over the front seat, gave him my best drunken seductive face, and said, "Do you want a party?" He stopped, looking blank for a moment before a huge grin widened across his face. "Oh, baby, yes. Where we go to party? You want a party here?" He started to adjust himself, and I wanted to rip it off and hand it to him. "Take that, freak," I thought to myself, before responding with, "No, not here. Let's get some beer and go to my place." He agreed, and I led him to my local gas station. "Pull in here and I'll go get some. What do you like?" I said sweetly. He said he didn't care, and as soon as he parked, I grabbed my bag and got out. He sat there waiting. My voice must have had an obvious tone of panic as I asked the lady behind the bulletproof glass, "Is Houston here?" She looked concerned and shouted for him. He came out from the back. I was so relieved, and in one hysterical breath, I told him everything. The expression on Houston's face darkened, and he said to me very curtly, "You, stay here." I walked to the window as he exited the store. He took 3 steps outside, whistled, and with arms out on either side, he made a "come here" motion. Out of the darkness came 20 really scary guys from both sides. He pointed to the cab and said something I didn't quite make out. Whatever it was, they swarmed that cab and tried to flip it over. That cab burned rubber peeling out of the parking lot. The men then looked back at the store window in Houston, laughed, nodded, and they disappeared back into the darkness. It was surreal. My jaw was on the floor. Houston came back inside with a grin. "I don't think he'll be back." I couldn't thank him enough. He was my hero at that point, hands down. it had started to rain, so he and his friend walked me home under a giant umbrella. There are no words to describe the restoration of my faith in humanity that night. Cliché as it sounds, there really is light in the darkest of places, and kindness in the most unexpected of places. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you reached your destination unharmed, relatively unharmed, unscathed. Don't forget to tip tonight's driver. My name is Warren. I hope you will all come and visit me at my channel, A Warning to the Curious, The Night Floaters, where I present original ghost stories and original horror stories featuring such cryptids as the Night Floaters, werewolves, and the Black-Eyed Children. And when you visit, please consider subscribing and help me to reach my goal of 2,021 subs in 2021. I'd like to thank Mort once again for his kindness in helping me to promote my channel. He has been a true mentor for me and for many others. He has been a real friend. Well, during these tough times, it's important that we all emulate Mort and help hold each other up through random acts of kindness. Random acts of kindness. And you can start right now by liking this video and then subscribing to my channel. See what I did there? But don't go away just yet. For I have an important announcement to make. Mort will be reading on my channel during the Ides of March, and you won't want to miss him. Even if you'd rather miss me. So, thanks for letting me get behind the wheel tonight of cab number 666 of the King in Yellow Cab Company. And Mort will see you in the next one.